So it doesn't even fit to this idea of teenagers just escaping. And on that same day, the police actually goes to the Bernie's house. David was still working, so they took Catherine. And eventually David either went back to his house, or I think the police went to pick him up.
They found he was at his workplace in Myrie, and they picked him up there.
Once at the police station, they were interrogated about Kate's story, and they would give contradictory stories. Catherine denied knowing Kate, while David actually said that they picked her up at the night, but he claimed that he had perfectly normal consensual sex with a teenager.
And that she had wanted to come back and smoke marijuana with them, and that everything was consensual. And
hours would pass, and the Bernies wouldn't say a thing, wouldn't, confess to their crimes. And it's eventually when the detective, Vince Katic, said to David Bernie, and the detective says like he was halfway through, he was partially being serious and partially telling him as a joke, quote, "It's getting dark. Why don't you just show me where the bodies are so we can dig them up?" And surprisingly, David Bernie replied calmly, "Okay, there is 4 of them." And once the police told Catherine that David actually confessed to several murders, not only the abducting of Kate, that Catherine started talking in a very matter-of-fact manner. It's the next day in which the Bernies took the police, or the police took the Bernies to the burials of their different victims. And Vince Katic also would say that neither David or Catherine showed any emotion until Catherine showed them the grave, quote-unquote grave, of Nolene Patterson, the victim, that she felt particularly jealous of. And Katic says that at this point, Catherine spat on Nolene's grave. So they were charged with 4 counts of murder and 1 count of kidnapping and rape Kate Moore. There is some archive video in which the Bernies are taken in custody. There is a mob outside insulting them and screaming at them. And Catherine doesn't show any emotion once again. And David actually blows a kiss to the mob. When they were both in jail, they were taken to separate jails. It says that they both took some beatings from their inmates, their fellow inmates, so this is how bad everybody felt about the Bernies. During that time in jail, they would exchange letters for several years. I think there were over 2,000 letters, but within a few years, Catherine would just simply stop answering David's letter, surprisingly. She would later on say that she didn't felt like she needed him. Sorry, I have an issue with pronouns. And she would exchange letters with Eileen Wuornos and with a female serial killer as well, Myra Hindley, whom was part of the Moors murders in Great Britain. Another killer couple that had pretty much the same profile as the Bernies. They were a couple that would abduct and rape and murder children. I feel it's very curious that she actually was exchanging letters. I couldn't find much information about that, so I don't really know if Eileen Wuornos was answering the letters. But I think it's very curious because Eileen Wuornos would call herself a bounty hunter of rapists. So I don't really know how much sympathy she would feel toward Catherine, that was abducting and helping her partner murder women. So yeah, very much curious. And David Bernie would hang himself the 7th of October of 2005. There are 2 reasons why it says that he committed suicide. First off, he wasn't receiving some psychiatric medication he was supposed to be taking, allegedly because of depression. But also, on that same day, he was going to go on trial for the rape of an inmate. So, there you go, David.
Mm.
And Catherine is still very much alive. She's still in jail because they got 4 life sentences, and she works, so to speak, as a librarian in the prison. Now, there is a thing, according to the Australian law, in which after 20 years of being incarcerated, an inmate is going to be automatically, how do you say when they start consider them for a parole?
They have parole hearings. So they're eligible for parole, and after rejections, which I believe her last one would have been 2019.
Yep.
So she will be up for another parole hearing with the potential of limited release next year.
And there was a campaign to modify this law that was very much led by Kate Moore. She certainly doesn't want Catherine Burney to get out of jail. And she was also supported by Tanya, David Burney's only child. She claims in an interview that she had actually a good childhood, apart from the fact of
her father being David Burney.
Being David Burney, having affairs and this and that he was a kind father, but that she figured out that was just a mask he performed to simulate normality. She's now 40 years old, and she claims that she never had any serious relationship. She never had children, and she doesn't want to have children because on one side she's afraid she would ever encounter a man like her father. And
the other side is she is worried that she will pass on some sort of genetic trait that her father has, and that she will birth another serial killer the likes of her father into the world, which she states she could not live with. So she has essentially chosen to remove the Burney genetics from the face of the earth.
And she claims that also her and the children of Catherine and their victims are living in a sort of life sentence, which they will never be released, the trauma. So her position is, then why should we give freedom to Catherine Burney? And also James, one of Catherine Burney's son, also called for his mother's execution, and he claims that he's been attacked and beaten because of his relationship with his mother. The Burneys never showed little to no remorse for their crimes. In his trial, David Burney would point, they declared to be guilty, both of them. And when David Burney was asked why he pleaded guilty, in the trial he would point at his victims' families, and he would say, this is the least thing I can do for them. Which I'm sure this is David Burney being pretty much a fucking manipulative piece of trash. And in a letter that Catherine Burney sent to her children, she says that she did everything for love. She tells her children that they should be careful for the people they partner. And at the end, she says she encouraged them to cut all contact with her and says, quote, I don't deserve to have children because of what I did to the children of other people. Well, that's pretty much the idea. So I guess we could say that she showed some sort of remorse. Probably we have to consider that she wasn't with David during jail, so she kind of lose perhaps her attachment to him.
Which isn't uncommon, I think, from what we've seen with dependent couples who go on murder sprees, that once that intimate interpersonal bond is broken, they do tend to, the dependent partner tends to drift apart and, you could say, come undone from the spell of the relationship, of the dependency, and then rediscover their own, or develop their own personality again, and stop being under the influence of the dominant partner.
Precisely. In the documentary Beyond the Darklands, the clinical psychologist Leah Garriatano does a small profiling. She doesn't do the profiling of Catherine, but more like the one of David. She's focusing on him, and she would say that he's both a narcissist and antisocial, which they are two personality disorders. They share a couple of characteristics. They are actually comorbid, so a person diagnosed with one of those disorders can also have the other one. And, I'm not going to start doing the profiling right now because we talk a lot, but the things that they both disorders have, it's a tendency to manipulation, a lack of remorse, and a lack of empathy. And while being in the trial, a clinical psychologist would say that Catherine Burney is or was the worst case of the dependent personality he had ever seen. So those are the facts. What are your thoughts on them, Chris? Well,
back in the 80s in Australia, as with a lot of countries, as we saw in the USA, with young people hitchhiking and readily receiving lifts from strangers. Whereas now, obviously, there's been a very heavy campaign. Some would, in some cases, scare campaign into stranger danger and never receiving lifts from strangers and that sort of thing. But back at the time, Australia was still Australia still is a very friendly place. And it is, even today, not uncommon for someone who you've only just met to offer you a lift. And obviously, depending on your quick assessment and possibly also how much you've had to drink and bond with the person beforehand, it's not unusual to jump in a car with someone you've just met for them to give you a lift somewhere. And that's just a normal part of life. But particularly back in the 80s, I think it was a lot more, some would say, naive or possibly innocent. Not to say that terrible things didn't happen back then, they clearly did. And a lot of the time were just glossed over or dismissed. But that being said, it clearly wasn't uncommon to, especially for young women, to jump in a car with someone, provided they felt that it was safe. Whereas nowadays, the chances of that happening are pretty much 0 to none I feel in Australia, particularly in Perth, and particularly around that stretch of Stirling Highway, which has seen many, many, many unfortunate disappearances and murders. In the recent decades, we saw the Claremont serial killer, who also acted in that same area and abducted and murdered several women. But that's a story for another time.
And we don't have to forget that they were a couple. Women would feel, I reckon, safer by seeing another woman in the car, and that was pretty much the technique they would use. According to what Kate Moore says, she heard Catherine Burney saying to David, "I've got the munchies," and David would answer, "I've got the munchies too." which was like their secret code.
Their code word for